Robin Gill.
Good evening and thank you for joining us. We begin with drastic new measures to slow the spread of COVID-19 and help Canadians get through the pandemic. The Canada-US border is now being shut down to non-essential travel as officials on both sides scramble to fight off the virus. Here at home, disruptions are growing by the day, and so is the financial fallout. Today, the federal government unveiled a massive $82 billion aid package to help Canadians cope.
In these extraordinary times, our government is taking extraordinary measures. In Canada, public health should never hinge on financial considerations.
Coming up, we break down the numbers, what the government is promising, and what's in it to help you. But first, the latest from the front lines. Quebec recorded its first death today. That brings the total number of deaths in Canada to 9. More than 700 people have now tested positive in Canada. Most of the cases are in BC, Ontario, Alberta, and Quebec. BC saw a major spike today, 45 new cases, bringing the total to 231. Ontario, Alberta, and Quebec all reported double-digit increases. Elsewhere in Canada, here's where the numbers stand at this hour.
We start to see a sharp rise in cases, and a number of provinces have reported cases with no links to travel. This is a signal that there is some degree of community spread, so our time to act is now.
All the provinces are ramping up their response to the outbreak. Just today, Newfoundland and Labrador and the Northwest Territories declared public health emergencies. In BC and Saskatchewan, provincial states of emergency are now in place. A lot has changed in this country in just 1 week, and officials say it won't be over anytime soon. Here's Mike Armstrong with how the government plans to help.
The Prime Minister was beaten to the punch just an hour before Justin Trudeau stepped out of self-isolation to announce the historic closure of the Canada-US border. The US President took to Twitter, Donald Trump tweeting out that the two countries had agreed to shut down the border to non-essential traffic.
Travelers will no longer be permitted to cross the border for recreation and tourism.
Now, there is a concerted effort by both governments to ensure commercial trade continues to flow. Truckers, for example, are exempt. When the U.S. closed its border to China and then later to Europe, it did so unilaterally and without warning. The closure with Canada was negotiated and mutual. Keeping supply lines open is too important to both countries.
There was not even an atom, a molecule of pushback on that.
The other major announcement was the COVID-19 Economic Response Plan. There are two parts. There's $27 billion in direct support to Canadians and $55 billion in tax deferrals. Together, that's about 3% of the country's GDP and a massive dent in the federal budget.
Usually my job is to ensure that we maintain our fiscal track. But right now, as Minister of Finance, my only job is to make sure that Canadians can keep food in the fridge.
Now, the goal is to help the people who need it most. There's an emergency care benefit for people who don't have access to paid leave. That's about $10 billion. There's a program to help workers who lose their job in this crisis, $5 billion. There's also a temporary business wage subsidy, $3.8 billion to incentivize employers to keep workers on their payroll. There's also support for student loans, Indigenous communities, and homeless shelters. Now, Ottawa's moving the deadline for Canadians to file their taxes. Instead of April 30th, it's now June 1st. And there's also some relief coming for people nervous about paying mortgages. The country's 6 biggest banks have agreed to allow personal and small business customers that have to defer mortgage payments for up to 6 months. Robin?
Mike Armstrong in Ottawa. Thanks, Mike. The emergency fund is aimed at helping Canadians pay for groceries and rent and to help businesses meet their payroll. Abigail Bimman shows us who's eligible and how Canadians can access the aid.
This Ottawa bookstore closed its doors but is shipping out care packages.
They say if they like mystery books or fiction, history, whatever, and we have a surprise package. And we drop it off at their place.
But the owners still had to put their dozen staff on leave and have had trouble getting through by phone to the right government agencies for EI help. Others report the Service Canada website is crashing as they try to sign up.
Anything would help, for sure.
Two major planks of the government plan are the emergency care benefit and the emergency support benefit. The care benefit is short-term help for those without paid sick leave, parents with kids out of school, caregivers for the sick, and people under quarantine. The government says people will be eligible for up to $450 a week for 15 weeks, starting in April. You can apply through Service Canada, the CRA, or a toll-free number that hasn't been released yet.
It will require a simple attestation that will not require medical documentation. We want this to be as easy as possible.
The emergency support benefit is longer-term help for Canadians who lose their jobs or hours due to COVID-19 but aren't eligible for EI. Details are still coming about how to apply. And for 12 million low and modest income families, there's a boost to the Canada Child Benefit and a one-time goods and services tax credit. Ottawa says these two measures combined would amount to $1,500 for a single parent with two children. The top-ups will come to you automatically from the CRA based on last year's filings. There's also a temporary payroll subsidy for small employers, equal to 10% of pay, up to $25,000 per business. And all of this is a start.
I will highlight, of course, that the Emergency Measures Act is a significant step, not one that we feel we need today, but not one that we are closing the door to in the future if necessary.
The Prime Minister considering every option in a rapidly evolving situation. Abigail Bimman, Global News, Ottawa.
The U.S. is considering a $1 trillion plan to counter the economic fallout, but it hasn't been enough to calm investors. In North America, the markets plunged again today, with trading halted briefly on Wall Street for the second time in 3 days. The Dow sunk to a 3-year low. The loonie was pushed below 70 cents U.S., a 5-year low. And the price of crude went crashing under $22 a barrel for the first time since 2002. With investors worried about a sharp drop in demand. There's a lot of volatility right now, and the U.S. and Canada are very interconnected. Jeff Semple is in the Niagara Falls region, where tourism is already taking a big hit. Jeff?
Well, Robin, the world's longest undefended border is also one of the busiest. A couple 100,000 people cross the Canada-U.S. border every single day. But tonight, governments on both sides are getting ready to shut the door. This is what Niagara Falls usually looks like. Crowds gathering for a glimpse of one of the world's 7 natural wonders. But today, that picture postcard sits empty.
But right now, it's just a ghost town. It's really sad to see.
The owner of this decades-old family restaurant says March break is typically one of their busiest weeks. Instead, they've just laid off 80 staff. This is worse than SARS, she says, even 9/11. That was the last time the U.S. border was closed, and it only lasted a couple of days.
We're just hoping this ends quickly.
The government says these measures could last months, but the closure will not affect what it calls essential travel, deliveries of food, fuel, and medicine. $2 billion worth of goods crosses the border every day.
Supply chains, including trucking, will not be affected by this new measure.
But the American and Canadian governments are shutting the door on hundreds of thousands of others, including tourists like this family.
Pretty empty. Restaurants closed. The fall is still working, right?
And cross-border shoppers, such as this American stocking up on Canadian candy bars.
Coffee Crush, #1, oh Canada for sure.
We need to do all we can to contain this virus, and we don't need leisure traffic going across the border to go shopping for cheaper gas, eggs, and beer.
But the mayor says they will need financial assistance from the federal government for the many businesses and employees affected.
I hope the government comes up with something to help people.
Some health experts question whether these travel bans make much of a difference. But the economic impact is much easier to predict.
This is not going to be without suffering and pain for a lot of people, particularly vulnerable Canadians. Canadians working on hourly wage basis, gig economy. A lot of young people who don't have secure employment are on contract.
And that impact felt most, perhaps, in these border communities. Niagara Falls does about 80% of its business between the long weekends in May and September. And they're urging Canadians to do their part to help to curtail the outbreak and lessen the impact on the economy. As for exactly when this border will close, Robin, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau wouldn't give a specific date except to say very soon.
Jeff Semple in Queenston, Ontario. We know you have lots of questions about this virus. Jeff will continue to consult with experts and try to answer them. So email your questions at globalnews.ca. On our website, you'll find a special page dedicated entirely to the new coronavirus. That's at globalnews.ca/coronavirus.